Hello and welcome to GreenFleet Talks. My name is Kate Armitage and I'm your host for our discussion today. I am delighted to be joined by Jan Marsden, who is Chief Revenue Officer at the innovative on-street charging CPO, Char.gy. Hi, Jan.
Good to meet you, Kate.
Good to meet you today. Jan, I'm going to... we've got a lot of ground to cover and we will be focusing very much on the on-street charging landscape that Char.gy is so well known for. But I just wanted to pick up on recent events on the political landscape, which have created a fair bit of turbulence around the ICE vehicle ban deadline, which was 2030, has now been moved to 2035. And we understand with our new Labour government that will be pulled forward again. And this has implications, doesn't it, for local authorities who are under increasing pressure to deploy ambitious on-street charging infrastructure targets, potentially sooner than they originally expected. Can you kind of give me an overview of what implications that's had for you and the work that you're doing with the local authorities?
Yeah, really good question, Kate. I think most of the authorities that we've been working with over the last couple of years have had their strategies in place for 5 or 6 years. So they were working to the original timeframes with the ban coming in 2030. And all of the data and the uptake figures that they were given still retain that 2030 guideline. I think there was maybe a bit of a relaxation in pace when the 2035 guideline came up for many of the people outside of the public sector, but their strategies were focused on making sure that the infrastructure was in place for that. I think we've seen other delays that perhaps weren't expected, like the general election, which put a pause across both central and local government on activities to bring these tenders into market. But there still appears to be a strong ambition to make sure that we hit those deadlines. I think we will still see the ripple effect of the early election on those tenders, maybe pushing them out a few months. But in general, measured in terms of years, I think we'll still be on track to hit those 2030 guidelines.
Okay. And I guess, and we'll talk about this again in a minute, but I guess that the Levi infrastructure funding, which was began last year and is being deployed in anger now and next year, is again has been a catalyst for keeping this at the forefront of the local authorities' minds, irrespective of the ban date moving in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing catalyst. £320 million of grants help stimulate, plus grants that have been put in place to build the capability to even work through these tenders, have been the biggest catalyst for change and will be the biggest catalyst for change going forward. So we've started seeing the very first of those Levi bids come to market, in fact, last week. With Suffolk releasing their Levi bid. We can expect that to continue and escalate over the next few months, heading towards Christmas, where we'll probably see a peak of potentially 30, 35 bids all coming out at the same time. It does put a huge strain on the industry as we look to engage in those bids. And what we've been doing in the meantime, when this delay has been happening, is working with those local councils to help them understand what these tenders are trying to achieve and how to make them investable. Because if we look at what the Levi grant is supposed to do, it's supposed to attract a significant amount of private funding to match that grant funding that's come from the public purse. And the idea is to not only accelerate the rollout of the networks, but be ambitious in the size and scale. So the pieces of work we've been able to do with this pause is starting to work with local authorities in how to look at their own concessions, which is what these are. This isn't buying equipment anymore. This is a concession to run a service, to make those as attractive for private investment as possible. That way we can make the public purse stretch further. So the more attractive a concession is, the more likelihood private investors will match, or maybe even more than match, the funding that's available, to make sure that those networks the public sector is trying to roll out are equitable, available to all, and not just the ones that are more likely to use EVs in the short term, and also provide value for money. Although there is a great concern with a large percentage of the population to ensure our planet is greener, to ensure that we have sustainable transport, we're all under economic pressures. So if the change to sustainable transport is more expensive or less cost effective, it is going to, at the very least, act as an anchor on change. So that Levi funding enables us to focus on delivering low cost or high value infrastructure, but then doesn't pass on the burden of paying for a premium for the service to drivers. In other words, what does that relate to? It means that the service that the drivers will be using will be cheaper than using a petrol or a diesel car. In fact, it will be as close to charging at home using special overnight tariffs as we can possibly get. And that itself, the economic incentive alongside the sustainable incentive, I think that those will be the biggest catalysts to change that we'll see.
Yeah, and you mentioned at the beginning there equitable, and this is so important because we can't underestimate the importance of having, like you say, high volume, low cost on-street infrastructure to benefit the people who are not able to take their car onto their own driveway and charge using their own private wall box and use their domestic electricity supply, which is the cheapest. So that this is absolutely crucial, isn't it, to the widespread take-up of electric vehicles in the UK?
Yeah, for me, this is what this programme is supposed to do. The reason why government is intervening and providing grant funding is because this will become a critical infrastructure that should be available to everybody. If this was left purely to the private sector, then effectively it becomes a very simple business model, which is around risk and revenue. How can you drive as much revenue as possible and minimize the risk? That means that the private sector would be attracted to only those sites that immediately provide the highest returns, which will leave, by its very necessity, huge segments of the population from being able to access or even consider this kind of service. So what we've been working with councils is what we call the basket approach. So this is recognizing that if you want to have a truly ubiquitous network, one that's equal and fair, then there needs to be a consideration for, let's call them socially important sites to signal intent, and also commercially viable sites which drive revenue and therefore further investment. Now, eventually, as we all move to electric cars, all of those sites are commercially viable, but there is a significant lag in some areas before they do. So this basket approach, this balance of those two potentially competing objectives, it is very important to tune that so that those incentives are aligned.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Jan, and you're absolutely right, of course, that if it was 100% private investment, you would look very closely at the utilization rates and the location of the infrastructure, because your objective is to get your return on investment. But of course, by doing so, you would risk having effectively charging deserts where whole swathes of the population would not have access to that infrastructure. So I think, and of course, your point that eventually all locations will be good locations, which I truly believe, but it's not going to happen overnight, and we are a long way off that. And in fact, I think the UK is still on quite an early path for the on-street charging infrastructure. I mean, and we've discussed it, GreenFleet for years and years, but I look at the success of the Netherlands concession model, and that's really what we're striving for, isn't it? You know, that there should be a charge point within 250 meters of your house or your place of work.
We've started, interestingly, when we started engaging with the marketplace, they were specifying particular streets. When I say the market council, specific streets, and I think they were driven by resident demand in those early days, or potentially we think these will be early adopters. And I think some of the more progressive councils have now switched to actually what's the outcome we want to achieve in these concessions. And this is where we start to find that balance of commercial versus social goals. One of the outcomes should be how far am I comfortable with walking away from my car and allowing it to charge by itself. And that distance, when I started 9 months ago with charging, was about 10 minutes. And then within a few months, it's gone down to 5 minutes. And now we're looking at 2 to 4. Yeah. And that feels about right. That feels like where I would leave my car if it was an ICE car at the moment. And that is the challenge that industry should take up as part of making sure these networks are equitable. So maybe if we're trying to disperse the network as widely as possible, because we don't really know where EV take-up will happen. That is at best an educated guess where we think EVs will be used. Maybe it's to do with social demographics, but even we found that in our present networks has been debunked. The only people who buy EV cars happen to be people who can afford £40,000 Teslas. We've now found that in the second-hand market, where we're seeing parity, that is dropping to the point where you've got an incentive for people who depend on their vehicles to do their work, and now one of the biggest adopters of EVs, which is fantastic. So not just taxi drivers, which is the obvious place, but your hairdressers, your carpenters, your chippies. We've also taken on board a second principle, which is how do we disperse that network as widely as possible? We use the phrase seed, and then feed, and then maintain. So what does that mean? That means, to begin with, the first flush of deployments are trying to get a charging point or charging points as widely dispersed across your geography as possible. We always build a couple of years ahead of demand, but then we monitor each one of those charging points as they pick up. And on average, it takes about 6 to 9 months to see a couple of EVs emerge in each one of those streets. As we see the demand start to rise, then you look to a middle point between two charge points, which are rising, to put another charge point in place. And so now we infill. This is the seed, feed, and then maintain. So we start feeding additional charge points in where we're seeing the uptake. That creates more momentum. We have more charge points, and then we fill out the network. So the third part that we talk to councils about is ensuring that these concessions are really focused on sustainability. And there's two ways to think about sustainability. Yes, there's the green agenda around sustainability, but there is actually making the business case sustainable, because the grant funding has happened generously, but it will only happen once.
Yeah,
that isn't enough to supply all of the capital funding for the entire 15 years. Yeah. So what we try and help the councils understand in the business cases is how the revenues that are brought into the project are used to continue to build out the network, to sustain it over its period, not just maintain it to provide high availability, but to continue to grow the network until there is no more demand left. I think that's when we can say we're successful. So sustainability from a commercial point of view is at the heart of the business models that we're sharing with councils at the moment.
Great. And one thing that it's a word that I don't like using, because I think it's very challenging, but people talk about future-proofing, and the charge point technology is developing all the time. How do you work? How are you kind of preparing your local authority partnerships in such a way that you can accommodate the next generation of charging technology?
Yeah, it's great. Again, a good question to consider that if you look at any technology over any span that spans more than a decade, there's cycles of huge transformative change. I think we start with the fact that I don't think the plugs are going to change. So we start with a foundation technology, which is a symbiotic relationship between the supply of electricity and the cars that you're plugging into. I think what we will see around the outside of that is a huge amount of change around the software and applications that support that service being made more accessible to drivers and more able to deliver value-added services on top of that. So having a flexible software wrap around that is going to be essential. The second part is the technology itself, the hardware. These, although they are robust, at least the first and second generation of these charge points are robust, we believe they will last 10, 15 years. It's inevitable that a percentage of that infrastructure, that state, will be changed out. So we have, probably like other charge point operators, an R&D program that constantly runs that's looking to do two things. It's looking to improve the reliability and lower the cost of delivery so we can, again, get more charge points out there. So we, for instance, have just brought out a second generation of our charge point that is significantly lower and smaller and faster than the original one. Still does exactly the same job. Still plug in your car to that charge point, still deliver the same service. But now we're with a lower build cost and a lower size, we can get to more places for a lower cost, therefore more charge points. So during the cycle of that 15 years, I would expect the units themselves to become more sophisticated in delivering a service, but that's mainly going to be the software capabilities around the outside, but also more effective in delivering that service because there'll be lower costs to manufacture and deploy those units as well. There is also, we've got to keep our heads out and scanning to see whether other technologies that would complement that key foundational technology make sense in different areas. So the deployment of batteries alongside charge points to take advantage of lower cost charging at night, but we could use those to provide lower cost charging during the day, or whether we could use that kind of technology to provide higher charging speeds in certain locations. So taking you almost up to kind of DC charging speeds using low speed AC power. So these kind of things are being thought about at the moment, and we're trialing some of these elements. And we've also trialed parallel technologies like wireless charging as well, see where they would fit in and what that looks like as part of the ecosystem. So we're keeping our eyes open on technical advancement, but always with the eye of the driver can't be paying for this. In order for this to work, it can't impact or dissuade the driver from keeping their EV. Again, if it moves up to a point where it's more expensive to run an EV than it is to go back to a petrol or a diesel car, then we have failed as an industry. So we're looking for these technologies to provide that improved customer service and value.
Right. Well, it sounds very exciting times, very interested in all the R&D stuff and the innovation that you're doing, Jan, and hopefully we'll get an opportunity to discuss that again at a later date. My last question to you is you mentioned cost and bringing down the cost of the charge points, but when you kind of your elevator pitch, if you like, what are the 3 or 4 things that local authorities should be considering on a successful EV charging network when it comes to costing and procuring EV charge points?
So I think I'll start with the one main point where I think both us and the public sector are fully aligned, which is we should be doing the most good for the most people. And what does that mean in terms of the public responsibility? Is with the public purse, they want to provide they should be providing the widest possible service for the widest amount of people. On our side, we're looking to do the most good for the most people, because if we're able to provide a value for money service and reach the widest possible audience, obviously we're going to grow the biggest business, grow a large sustainable business. So if we look underneath that at the points that support it, what does that mean? It means making really good decisions about how much we are spending in reaching every single driver in terms of delivering the infrastructure. It means understanding sympathetically how we are rolling out the network to continue to allow the business case to be sustainable, to bring those revenues in order to build out the network at speed. And then the last part, which is at the heart of delivering the service to any consumer, is both convenience and reliability. So we're ensuring, as part of our capability as we roll it out, that 99% availability should be the bare minimum that anybody should expect for this critical service, and that it is near to the homes where you will be spending the night after you've left your car. So convenience and reliability around that driver experience is the third angle.
Jan, thank you very much. It's always interesting when I speak to a finance director or a revenue officer, because you have a very well balanced view on how the market needs to grow in a sustainable way, which is certainly going to be a challenge, I think, in the next few years within this marketplace.
I'll just reply to that point. And I think we have seen, or we are seeing now, a transition from that very early innovator, early adopter stage where everybody's excited about the technology. And there were lots of pilots around, could this work? Should this work? Which way should it work? I think that's behind us now. We know the technologies work. There's literally tens of thousands of charge points out there, and almost 1 million EV drivers out there. So now we have to consider, how do we continue that momentum? Yeah. And that does come down to a commercial conversation. How do we make it accessible for the drivers? How do we make sure that the companies who are delivering the service are robust enough to continue delivering it for the next 10, 15 years? So I think I've come at the right point to help with that transition, a transition on sustainable investment into this sector.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this topic is one that many companies are grappling with at the moment in this particularly innovative space. Jan, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
You too, Katie. It's been really time well spent. I appreciate it.
Good. Of course, thank you to Char.gy for joining GreenFleet Talks. That is about all we've got time for. Thank you for watching, and please tune in to GF365 again soon.